Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Canadian Story. We're joined by my friend Kris from the Taxpayers Federation. Welcome, Kris, to the show. Kris, do you want to share a bit about your background? You have a very wealth of political knowledge, political skill, and you've been in advocacy for a while. So why don't you share a bit about who you are and what makes you tick?
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here on the show. I'm an avid listener and I hope I measure up. Very briefly, I'm the Alberta director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. The CTF, as we're called, has been around for 30 years. We were more than 30. We started in 1990 before the internet existed. And what I love about them is they're very grassroots. We've got more than 235,000 supporters across the country. And we're the ones that will either give you a 70-page pre-budget consultation meeting at committee or set a dumpster on fire to get your attention, or hand out golden pig statues to politicians for wasting your money. So we're nonpartisan, but we are determined to have lower taxes, less waste, and accountable government. I love all those elements. Lately, I really love the accountable government part because I think it gives people agency and it gives people a voice. And boy, oh boy, people aren't happy right now. Personally, I've got now 25 years experience, mostly in national journalism. I'm originally from Hope, British Columbia. I'm a small town, rural Western gal, but I worked on Parliament Hill, both in national media. I was a founding member of Sun News Network from startup to shutdown when the CRTC pulled our plug. And I've also worked on the other side, actually, a little bit in government. So I've been really lucky here in Canada.
So you've seen a lot of things that normal people, perhaps most of our listeners who are not necessarily the most politically engaged up until recently, where they've realized that they have to be. I would say most of our listeners are those people. Zach is even one of those people who was not engaged at all, even though his cousin was so involved in politics, he didn't really care. And now he cares a lot and has become very informed. What would be some of the insights that you have as someone who's been an observer and a practitioner of politics as to what's changed over the last, let's call it 6 years, from kind of when you started, and you were started much longer than 6 years, but like I've been in about 18 years now, and I've seen drastic changes from the reform movement that became the Alliance, that became the Conservative Party of Canada. Things that mattered to those people were fiscal responsibility, fairness for the West. It seemed like a simpler time, to be honest. What do you think has largely changed that has made politics something that people have to care about again?
Well, I think Pierre said it well a few months ago when he said governments become big and bossy. And just because you don't take an interest in politics doesn't mean politics won't take an interest in you. That's unfortunately true. I think in an ideal world, average folks, civilians, as us in the game often call them, shouldn't have to pay such close attention to politics. It should be a relatively well-oiled, small-ish government machine that just, keeps the streets clean and keeps the cops paid. And we don't need to be watching them like hawks to make sure that they're not trying to gag our free speech online or seize our firearms. But they are. And so I think the major change, I would say, in the last 7 years or so is just the rapid expansion of government and the corresponding permission-seeking attitude that I have seen in people who should know better. And people who should know better, speaking personally, because I've got experience in the Parliamentary Press Gallery, are quite often veterans of the Parliamentary Press Gallery, observers of politics. I've had experience literally chasing politicians down a hallway with a camera running on my shoulder and having the reporter, bark questions at them. Like, that's what democracy should be. And now I've noticed it's just like, are we allowed to, open a store here? Am I allowed to own a pickup truck and fill it up with diesel if I want to? Am I very much a kind of meek permission-seeking sort of attitude. And being from rural Western Canada, and I moved to Ottawa because I heard the call from Preston Manning in the reform movement. And I liked that. I liked the idea of direct democracy and referendums and recall legislation, fire the bastards if they don't do the right job. That's where I think citizens and government should be. And that's changed a lot. I don't know, maybe I don't want to know how much it might have changed in the West, but I sure have noticed a tone change coming out of what I usually call the Quebec-Windsor corridor. Other folks may call them the Laurentian elite, but I'll leave that for other folks. The Quebec-Windsor corridor, the tone has changed to permission seeking from government, and that shouldn't be the way it is.
Now, we've had guests on here. We've talked a lot about kind of the Canadian ethos, which is much more of a polite, deference to authority. And I mean, that's a lot of that comes from our English roots of classism. And I mean, the English are pretty content with having classes. They have their elite and then they have their regular people. And that's kind of how they are. And a lot of Canada was founded, especially let's say in that Quebec-Windsor corridor, by loyalists, by people who liked following the rules and liked having a king, or in that time a king, and again now a king. And I think that does play a role in kind of how we're different than Americans, and we're not quite as, hold our government accountable. We kind of have been more trusting of our government in the past, governance. Mm-hmm. But we saw obviously with the convoy, and we've seen with movements like the Taxpayers Federation, which forced, I would argue, the Chrétien and Martin liberals to be very fiscally conservative and pay off debt even. And then that kind of pushed through into the Harper era. What do you see has changed in terms of that? Like we had the people of Canada were holding their politicians accountable. We were getting better government than pretty much we ever had. And that all seems to have fallen away. Why?
That's a great question. I think there's many answers to that. One, I think the bulk of our population has aged by 20-ish years. So the boomers are that much older. And I think sometimes we can forget just how much influence that has. I mean, if you're 1/4 to 1/3-ish bigger than the rest of the generations and you vote, and quite often you're a homeowner, you're a business owner, you're engaged, right? You're really deep in the game. They're older now, and maybe their priorities have changed a little bit. Maybe they're seeking more senses of security, and they're perhaps turning to government for that instead of themselves or their families or the communities. And there's less of the firebrand. But I don't know. I hope that's not the case, because we used to, speaking personally with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, I used to get about maybe one phone call a month or every 6 weeks from someone who is working, busting their butt, working hard, who still can't make it. And especially when I was out in BC, where the housing is just crazy, crazy costs. Now I get one of those phone calls every week of somebody saying, hey, I don't know if you can help me, but I'm working this job. I'm working 2 jobs. My rent is $2,400 a month and it's half a freaking house. I'm on my 3rd job. And so those are typically younger people, like my generation, Gen X and a little bit younger. And they're looking for something to do to fix this mess. And so I think that engagement of our generation and slightly younger will take up for whatever perhaps lack of more radical engagement that the boomers may be slacking off on. Now, this isn't to say there's lots of boomers who are super ticked off and they know what's going on and they're ready to help. But I think that might be part of the issue. Another big element, and this is something that unless you've worked in media, I don't think a lot of people see, is the absolute hollowing out of newsrooms across Canada. So to give you an idea, I technically graduated from BCIT trade school in journalism in 99, but I got out a year earlier because you could do that if you got a full-time job. When I graduated then, the Vancouver Sun newspaper had 2 full-time reporters. And I mean pay your mortgage level salary reporters on softwood lumber. Just that one.
Just on that one beat.
I know, right? Like just that one beat. This, and it straight up, look it up, 1990, look mid-90s, right? So yeah, 2 full-time salaried positions at one newspaper, which was separate from all the other newspapers back then, for that one topic. Now expand that. Do like a thought process. There used to be entire groups of people who covered court every day. Like that's your job. I was a court reporter for a long time that covered City Hall, that covered, the regional municipality district of whatever. So there was always this constant flow. If you picture it like a conveyor belt, there was stuff coming down the conveyor belt in every single newsroom every day that you could plunk into your 6 o'clock, your 11 o'clock newscast. And there aren't anymore. Where there used to be, say, 20, 25 reporters, there's 2 now. 2. And they have to also do the internet stuff. It's not just print. It's not just TV. It's everything. And so that's why you're getting just constant government, like unfiltered government messaging. I'll put it nicely. If you don't want to put it nicely, you could call it propaganda, no matter what party it is. That's why you're getting unfiltered government messaging, because they literally don't have time. They're ripping and reading. They're taking that live for 2 hours because it feeds the beast for 2 hours. So there just isn't the content. So on that point, back to your point, there isn't the scrutiny. There isn't that fifth estate, which is literally why that show is called that, to keep an eye on those in power. And so that's why people have seemingly lapsed more into this sort of passive permission seeking, I think. And I agree with you to an extent that we are kind of the calmer, polite, peace, order, good governance. But what I loved about working in the House of Commons is that it was the Commons. Like the carpet's this color, it's green, because it's supposed to represent, apparently the story goes, it's supposed to represent the grass from the hills in England, where the common people would gather and then hold the royals to account. And that's why the Senate is called the Red Chamber. That's literally why there's a red carpet and a throne. And so I always liked the House of Commons for that reason, because you could get a private member's bill. You could present a petition. Even if you were a backbencher, if you knew how to do it, you could get your voice heard. I don't know if we're at that same level anymore, and I would like to see it come back.
So I like this because we've had people on to talk about the alternative media. We've had a few people who've left the mainstream media, but we haven't had that many people who've had the in-depth experience of trying to start an alternative media that didn't work. So I'd like to hear, like, this problem that you just expressed of the news not being reported anymore. This is something that we talk a lot about on this show, but even more importantly, I think the movement talks a lot about, right? Yeah. Like and we've been talking about it for a couple of, as long as I can remember, it's been I would say about 10 years that we've been talking about it heavily. And Sun News was a big part of that conversation when I was in government. Things have changed, it seems like. We're finally starting to get some traction. We're finally building our own thing. And we had to build it with no government funding, all on our own, through networks of people. Shout out to Michael Binion and the Modern Miracle Network on this. Shout out to the taxpayers. Like everyone, shout out to True North, Western Standard. Like there's finally this ecosystem rising. Why do you think that didn't happen with Sun News? And what do you think the movement learned from that experience? Because we definitely I think we learned a lot. I
love that question, even though it's a little painful. So there's my Sun News mug back there. I've got lots of stuff still around. There's many things to take from Sun. One, I think Corey Tenike, who started Sun News Network, Corey Tenike went about it in a really smart way. He kept in touch with everybody who he had ever met in mainstream media who expressed an opinion about being small government, independent, skeptical, like going against the grain, not being part of the cool kids, because that is a huge element of human behavior, of course. You get anybody into a tight club, they're going to try to push for conformity. Doesn't matter if it's high school or the Parliamentary Press Gallery. It's just human nature. So he, from what I could tell, he hasn't expressed this directly. He kind of kept an eye on all those folks for years. And then when he started Sun News Network, he based it off of the Sun Media newspaper chain, which is still going and is one of the oldest news organizations in Canada. I think that fit was a little bit awkward. I think because of CRTC rules and union rules and shop rules and stuff, we weren't quite able to engage fully with the wealth of newsrooms from Montreal out to Vancouver that we otherwise would have liked to. Also, we were a little bit early. We were just before like streaming and subscriptions and doing what we're doing right now. So I'll put it this way, when we first were doing interviews on Skype, at Sun News Network, I was getting emails and phone calls from my friends at, CTV or Global, whatever, saying, what are you doing? You shouldn't put Skype on TV. Now, I mean, it's just standard. And so I think the concept of Sun News Network was perfect and beautiful, and I'm really sad it's gone. We were killed by regulation. Every other major news network, so CTV, BNN, CBC, had what was called mandatory carriage. And that isn't at a cost to taxpayers, to be clear, but it is a fee that you pay when you subscribe to cable that automatically goes to a few networks. We didn't get that ever. And in some cases, networks out in Western Canada wouldn't carry us. Imagine Western Canadians not being able to see Sun News, right? So a lot of things contributed to it not just grinding to a halt. We tried doing things really big, like, excuse me, I'm fighting a cough here. Pardon me. We had really expensive mics and cameras and stuff. We had a sat truck. We went big. We didn't go small. And that has a lot of expense. But I think what's neat coming out of Sun News is what it kind of planted seeds with and fractured into. Ezra started Rebel. Candace Malcolm, who was also at Sun, started True North. Derek Fildebrandt, who used to have my job and was on Sun News frequently, started Western Standard, which Ezra also had owned previously. So it all kind of like grew into these, really cool descendants, basically, I see it as, of Sun News Network. And so I don't think it was a complete loss. But I think that basically it was born in mainstream media time, and now it's been resurrected in different forms in alternative media time.
Do you think, this is something I think about a lot, Zach and I are obviously in the alternative media space and expanding in that, trying to basically tell the truth is our big motto here, is just like what's going on. We just want to find out. We don't really care about the mainstream narrative. And honestly, to a degree, we don't even care about the alternative narrative. We just want the truth, right? And I think that's what a lot of people are hungry for, and why we've seen so much success in this alternative media space. When you look at the legacy media that you worked in, the mainstream media, and then the Sun, which was a precursor, like you said, I love that analogy, and the network that you just showed to everybody of three different main sources of news, particularly I would probably say for our audience, came from that organization that you were working from. It wasn't a lost cause. But what do you think the difference is with the alternative media now? Like what has changed? Is it the internet? Is it Skype? Is it the low cost of production that we can now have for content? Or is it a bunch of people like getting fed up and so they're migrating to just those sources?
Great question. And this isn't a cop-out, but I think it's all of those things that you just said. So like I can, from my iPhone now, I can go live whenever, pretty much wherever. This used to require a sat truck with at least two men to run it. A satellite truck that costs more than $1 million. So it is that. It's the technical and technological movement we've seen there. I think there's a major hunger for what people often refer to as real news or straight talk, where they don't feel that there's like a government narrative or a spin put on it. Now, and there's also, of course, the need to to feel heard. And so I think people are reaching for more nuanced editorial positions. So there's a huge need. There's a stampede right now, as far as I've ever been told by some of my folks in the alternative media, of viewership, eyeballs, people reading, people clicking, people subscribing. So that's a big element of it. Also, and this is where the experience, and I worked with some great hardworking people over in mainstream media for years. The experience in mainstream media is that it's being hollowed out. It's losing listeners. It's losing viewers. And I think it can't evolve quick enough. It's not adapting. And whatever reason that is, if it's, technical or unions or age, I'm not sure, contracts, it can't adapt as quickly as it would want to in order to keep its viewers. And also, and this is very particular about the Parliamentary Press Gallery. I was a member of the Parliamentary Press Gallery for years. I was a national producer. I was a reporter. As I mentioned earlier, there's a really tight groupthink there. And some of the folks who might possibly be listening to this, who might still be members of the gallery, might be saying, no, there's not. Number one, I doubt it. Number two, there is. There's a major groupthink. It's a lot like high school. It's like high school and you have access to national media. And I think people are sensing that. And that's why you hear quite often the same analysis on Global, on CTV and CBC. It doesn't matter that it's CBC is the state broadcaster that takes more than $1 billion a year. You're going to hear quite often the same opinion or analysis or angle or slant or whatever term you want to use it, framing, narrative. There's all sorts of nice terms. You're going to hear the same thing quite often on Global or CTV. I don't know how far down in the weeds you want to get on this, but I personally am seriously alarmed by the fact that the government is paying journalists and not just CBC. So we have we're calling for the CBC to be defunded at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. If folks like watching it and listening to it, like, fill your boots, pay for it yourself, figure it out, get subscriptions, do a bake sale, do donations. But now this is critical. The state is funding other journalists. And that means that the majority of the folks in the Parliamentary Press Gallery are depending, at least to some degree, on the guy they're interviewing for their paycheck or their job security. That is an obvious conflict of interest. It's so obvious that it's kind of embarrassing to have to point out. Andrew Coyne, to his credit, said, hey, guys, we can't go down this route. He said this years ago. This is a conflict of interest. Like, what are we going to do? So the vast majority of print are on payroll. And now we've seen Global come forward and say, we don't want to be left out, that they want government help. We don't know what context that means. Like, if it's just straight money, if it's a wage subsidy, if it's some regulation they want to see happen or change. But this has to be hammered home. The vast majority of what people consider to be mainstream journalists now are either directly on the payroll of the state or they're trying to become so. You can't do that. Yeah, we don't care. We're campaigning against the media bailout at the CTF here as well. So defund the CBC and stop giving reporters money, taxpayers money. We don't care if it's more of a left-wing thing like Canada Land or more of a right-wing thing like Western Standard. You pay your own way. Pay your people in your own way. Don't go to the state for it, because you're going to inevitably wind up with a massive conflict of interest. It's like a friend of mine compared this to a ref taking side bets on the game that they're calling, but still swearing, I'm sober as a judge. I can call this game straight up and down. You may think you'd be able to, but it's the perception of bias that is the killer when it comes to credibility. And if folks know that you're on the state payroll and you're turning around, you're covering the government, you got to stop. And so as an appeal to fellow journalists, just they have to get off of that funding. We can't have this.
Mm. Do you think that in, what's a long enough time, 15 years, the CBC, CTV, do you think those networks will survive the next decade and a half, or are we going to see them go under? What is your prediction? I have my own thoughts, but what is yours? What are yours?
I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too. I think I'll put it this way. Right now, the leader of the opposition is promising to defund the CBC. So that was a key campaign promise. If he becomes prime minister, or whoever the next prime minister is who's campaigned on defunding the CBC, that'll be a big question. So if they say, you know what, $1.2 million delete budget line item, gone, which is what we want to see done. None of this nibbling around the edges or let's reform it. I can change him. No, just pull the plug.
Be done with it. Be done with it. Yeah,
exactly. Just, go on your own. Now, will they be able to, get fit, get lean, figure out their messaging and provide, this kind of, collective radio show that people may like? I grew up on CBC Radio. I get it. Can they trim down and figure out a way to do subscriptions and, paid sponsorship, that sort of thing, endowments, all that stuff? There's lots of funding options out there for them. Maybe the CBC will be able to do that. So we'll see. As far as the big ones go, I think they can. I just don't know how it runs at the top right now, to be honest. It all depends on their executive team, how nimble they are, what sources of revenue they can find, what sort of regulations they may need to come from the CRTC, including maybe loosening up on regulation. They would need to adapt pretty quickly. And they've already tried doing that. And to a certain extent, they were pretty successful. They started doing what's called VJ, so video journalism. For the longest time, the industry standard was reporter standing in front of the camera, usually a cameraman standing behind, shooting the shot. And if you're CBC, you've got a producer on one side and an audio person holding a mic boom and maybe a few other people. But typically it was a reporter, camera person, and maybe a producer. Now, under video journalism, which was kind of pioneered by, remember Speaker's Corner and stuff that we used to watch, right? So it was kind of that style. Video journalism, so City TV, the new RO, all those ones were kind of jazzy in doing that. And that's where you're shooting it yourself. I was that for a long time. And you'd have to be creative. You'd have to shoot your stand-up in like a window or a mirror, right? Or I'd have to balance it on my car. And so they adapted that way and slimmed down. And it worked pretty well for a while. But now it seems that people are tuning out and turning away. And I think that's an audience problem. And so they're going to have to figure out a way to reappeal to the average working person that wants to listen to the news and deliver the news that they want to hear. And that's going to require more content. Like I said at the outset, they're going to have to be covering court and covering City Hall and doing the quote unquote boring stuff. And then folks will tune back in. Local news viewership on private TV stations has always been stronger, generally speaking, than loyalty to national newscasts. And that's because when I wake up in the morning, I want to know how much snow there is outside, how bloody cold it is, if my school's getting closed down because of whatever. I need to know that information. I want to know what my local government is spending its money on. I want to make sure if the sewer is going to be upgraded, what the date is on that. Local news used to cover all that stuff all the time. I want to know if there's a safety recall on my baby's car seat, all that meat and potato stuff. And so if they're going to survive, they're going to have to get leaner and meaner and slimmer and really focus more on those core beats again, instead of doing the ripping and reading, instead of just repeating whatever narrative is coming down the wire.
Now, what do you think, as someone who's been in journalism for a long time, what is the incentive for the journalists? Why are they doing this ripping and reading? Is it because they just don't want to work as hard? Is it because with technology they want to spend, people are spending more time on Twitter and that creates its own echo chamber? Let's dig into the psychology of the individual journalists a bit here, and why are they not honoring their profession the way that so many past journalists did? And obviously, I feel very close to this as someone who is very has a journalist that's very near and dear to my heart, who who does spend a lot of time trying to be a good journalist, but in this content mill environment that we exist in, she's forced to produce 5 articles a day, whereas the Globe and Mail reporter is producing 1 article a day.
Right.
And so we can, in a sense, in the alternative media, let's just do a little criticism here, it can end up being what's called a content mill, where you are just like taking the press release, rewriting it, or you're taking a story. We see this with Post Millennial all the time. They're just rewriting other articles, right? Like
reheats, I call them. They're reheats.
Rewrites. Yeah. They're not. This is not news. It's just content generation for clicks and for views. And then on the flip side of this, which I find very interesting, I like Zach's thoughts on this too. We have the long form podcast space, where people are spending more time than ever on deep, thoughtful conversations. Now, this is not a large, maybe as large a percentage of the population as, say, are watching TikTok videos, but we are seeing this emergence of long form content pretty much free of charge, generally speaking. So what do you think is happening to, let's call it, the information ecosystem?
Great question. One is just so overwhelming. It's like trying to drink out of a fire hydrant sometimes, where traditionally back, the way that these newsrooms were set up and first envisioned in mainstream news, and in the way that governments say, or organizations release news, it was in the sense of, you'd write 1 or 2 stories a day. You'd have, as a print journalist, as a reporter or a radio person, you'd have a read at the top of the clock and a small read at the bottom of the clock for news. So you'd have, say, a 4.5 or 5 minute newscast at the top that included clips, right, that were 10 seconds long, and then you'd have, say, a quick update, so a 2-minute one at the bottom of the clock. Then you go back to the host or music or whatever. There's that format, and then TV. Major TV networks, it was always, you have to, number one, if you're national, you got to feed your regionals. So that means that if you are the parliamentary reporter for CTV, you have to have a 2.5 minute long story, completely prepackaged and done, shipped off to all of your locals so they can run it. It's like, and by the time they're done their local news, they tap their papers and they say, oh, in Ottawa today. And then they throw to you, and there goes your story. That used to be your entire day of building that 2-minute news pack as a TV journalist. Now, we've got these 24-hour news stations they call it the beast for a reason, because they're always on. Those things are constantly, you need to put stuff in that hour. As crude as it sounds, that TV is on. We're not going to bars. The little test pattern where we sing "Oh Canada" is not coming up. You have to have stuff in there. And like you said, it's a content mill. And so I think, one, this gets back to my original point of bodies. There just aren't the bodies in the newsroom to cover all the stuff. And so since we don't have Bob and Sheila and Ahmed and Mike covering really substantive, like nutrient dense stories every single day in your newsroom and bringing you their package by 3:30 to voice it and 4:00 to put the graphics on it, it's not there. So they got to fill that hour, that 6:00 news hour, with something. And so that's why they're just taking the same feed that everybody else is taking. And so they're kind of in the content mill trap too. As far as whether, a Globe and Mail reporter working on one story every few days, that used to be the case. Like for an investigative piece with a lot of, say, maybe a whistleblower involved, or an access to information request, or you're doing a deep dive into the budget, those usually would take a few days, because you got to get your math right. You got to really think about it. You have to get all your quotes confirmed. They has to be true. Like all those checks and balances that journalists are supposed to go through. So that's supposed to be the norm. And then your daily feed would usually be, say, more of a junior reporter that would say, hey, this is what, Stephen Harper said in House Outs today, for example. So after question period, what did the leader of the opposition say about that? That's different. That's more, I would call it a run and gun daily fill. Okay. But I find now that the the alternative media in its growing pains, and it's going to do great. Like, I'm so impressed with what they're doing so far. They're in the run and gun stage still. They're trying to catch up. They're drinking from the fire hose. And so since they have a fraction of the mainstream newsroom's people, which was already decimated, they're running on a handful of people, and quite often younger people, who haven't had journalism training. And so they're learning on the job, which I'm a big fan of, like totally off the dock. If you want to, learn on the job as a journalist, I think that's a valid thing to do. But that takes a while, and you have to get it checked by your editor. And then now your editor's behind. So there's a lot of reasons why we get stuck in these content mills of just never being able to stop and analyze and do an in-depth piece. And to your point on the echo chamber of Twitter, that's true. You can get into the echo chamber, but if you call this an information ecosystem, Twitter is like the watering hole in that ecosystem, because that's where all the reporters are together and all the policymakers are together. And so, if we hear that C11 has been defeated, let's hope so, you're going to hear about that first on Twitter from one of the reporters or one of the committee members. If you hear that, Elon Musk is suddenly going to magically, get rid of the gun ban in Canada somehow, you're going to hear about that on Twitter. And so it's this kind of love-hate relationship that I think a lot of reporters.
Breaking news is kind of a Twitter thing now. It's not it's not a Facebook thing, hardly. It's not really, if I think about it, is there any other social media platform that is as focused on breaking news as Twitter is? I don't think there is.
No, I agree with you. There's some that you can sign up for, like your own email alerts and stuff. But as far as if you hear it first, it's going to be on Twitter, because that's where the herds are. Both mainstream, new media, policymakers, politicians, ex-presidents, you name them, they're all right there. And so, but to your point, that can be a time killer as well. Like, you can't do the in-depth, thoughtful analysis as a journalist on these topics if you're staring at your phone all the time. It's an attention destroyer. Then that's there you get into the psychology of like, how can you do the really contemplative, thoughtful, deep pieces that you'd love to and want to if you're constantly watching that reactor vibrate in front of you. So I think it's a multifaceted problem.
I think part of the beauty.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I think part of the beauty of what's happening in alternative, and you and your background might disagree with me. The old model is, and I think the old model is beautiful that you're talking about. The old model is, it might take a few days to get this story right, so we have to take the time so that we can bring our journalistic integrity to this story, because we want to make sure that we're reporting something that is true. I think that is one type of strength, and I think that's really, really important. But the type of strength that the alternative media is presenting in a lot of these long-form conversations, like the one that we're having, is we have a concept and we want to try to present truth, but you as a listener are going to come along with us throughout that journey as we try to hash it out, hopefully honestly, and get to a conclusion altogether. What do you think about the difference between those two models? What do you think is more useful to the listener?
I'm such a reporter, so I don't want to be a cop-out. I think both are really important. So we need the first one in order to conduct the second one. We need to be able to at least agree to what is true before we can try to have a discussion about what we do with that truth. So, as Ayn Rand said, A is A thing is itself. The verdict in court was this. Now we can talk about it, or why it happened, or who the judge was, or who appoints the judge. Then you get into the long form. And so I think they're not mutually exclusive. I think they're both super important. And the reason I get to court is because that is inextricably connected to our system of governance, right? Court is literally called court because that is where the king or queen held court. That is where one...
Right.
We're dragged in front of that power to be judged.
Yeah.
And everyone who's covered court can see how it looks similar to the House of Commons. The chairs aren't pews and they're faced this way, but there's still the grand poobah sitting in front of you in the form of the speaker. That's the ref. Very similar actually to the layout of a cathedral. There's the voice, there's the judge, there's the counselor out front, and there's all the flock on either side of the aisle, right? And the pews on either side. The way it's set up, it's almost identical. Actually, court nerd alert, if you go into the Spring Garden Road courthouse in Halifax, there's even stained glass windows and like old creaky oak
really?
pews.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was covering, of all things, a treason case there way back when there was a guy that was being accused of selling information to the Russians. Sounds like something from 1986, but it was true. And so I think the reason why I use court as an example is because that's where, we determine who is innocent and who is guilty and what the facts are. And we're, thank goodness, considered innocent until proven guilty. All of these beautiful things that we have in our Western system of democracy are quite often pronounced and defined and determined there, similar to where you make the laws in the legislature. And so that's why I think the fundamentals of reporting, of getting the facts correct, are essential. Now, what you do with those facts, what your opinion of them is, your reaction to them, that's all you, like freewheeling. But I think we need to have the determination of what we're talking about first. And so I think we need both. To your point on long form, it's just, like I said at the outset, it's such an honor to be sitting here talking with you guys about this, because I think long form conversations like this will be our way out of a lot of messes that we're in right now, because we don't actually, turns out, have a 10-second attention span the way I was taught in journalism school. Spoiler alert, not true. The fact that people tune in and listen to long form conversations like this gives me hope.
Well, surprisingly, a lot of people, like Zach and I like to imagine the number of people that listen to us in a room, just to create a perspective for ourselves. And there's, those rooms sometimes have thousands of people in them. And it's kind of a wild thought that, radio used to be this,
yes.
TV used to be this. There were so many things, but now we have the freedom. I like to say that one of the reasons the truckers rose up for the convoy was because they've been listening to a lot of podcasts on the road. Right? Like
I don't think you're wrong, man.
they're gaining education, right? They're constantly learning because they're constantly being fed. Not, this is the truth. These are the facts. This is how things work.
Yep.
They're being fed conversation, and which is the most human of activities. It's how we learn. It's how we grow. It's how we think. A lot of us. I always like to say I don't really have very many thoughts just going on in my head until I verbalize them.
Yes,
and that's
same.
just me. That's just me. There's lots of people. But when I'm thinking about things, I'm thinking of pictures and numbers and graphs and imagining, visualizing actual things. I'm not thinking in words necessarily. But then to interpret that into words makes it concrete and real. And that is most effectively done, in my opinion, through dialogue.
Isn't that magical? Just think about that. It's like you're kindling a thought.
Yeah.
As you speak it.
It's a really fascinating. I would love to even interview someone on that, because that's a whole other topic. But I think even hearing what you've said now suddenly people have the firsthand experience of someone who's worked in the media industry, and your perspective has validity that mine wouldn't, despite having worked with the media for a very long time. And that experience is being shared through conversation. So what have you seen shift in that? Because you've watched it go from, like you said, you're standing in front of the camera, you got the boom mic, you got that, to these free flow conversations. Where did that exist before, or did it exist before? Is this a new thing?
it did exist before. And I love your point about this is how humans learn, because that's how we learn. We talk to each other, we share experiences, to the point whenever I'm doing media training with people and they're like, I can't focus. Your focus of any good news story should always be people doing something for a reason. Go. It sounds so simple, but most of our beautiful truths are that simple. So we have done this before, and this is, it sounds funny having worked directly in mainstream TV for so long, but I think that was the outsider. I think having the 10-second clip and assuming people have a 30-second attention span, that actually was the misnomer here. We don't have time to listen to a 3-hour long discussion about the weather if we want to know what temperature it is. But if we want to talk about, why the government is trying to gag our free speech, that's going to have a longer conversation. Mike Wallace, for example, used to have a show on in the 60s where he would sit down, and now it was only an hour. It wasn't 3 hours or 4 hours, but it was a solid hour. He'd sit down with the smartest people around. He talked to Aldous Huxley, talked to Ayn Rand, talked to whoever. They'd sit there and smoke cigarettes. It was the two of them and like a fern and a discussion. That was standard. I read that U.S. presidential debates and candidate debates used to be 5 hours long. They would go for 2.5 hours.
Whoa.
And then everybody would have a break and eat pie. And then they go back and discuss things for another 2.5 hours. So I think that's pretty important.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. We're closing in on our time, but Zach, I'm sure you have a few questions. I know.
Yeah.
I keep talking.
You brought up something that I think is super important that gets glazed over all the time. The government trying to gag our speech. This you are someone who has done speech as a career. So this would be, I imagine, incredibly concerning to you as it is to me. What do you know about that? What do you believe the motives are? Why is this happening?
So this is something we are directly fighting. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Straight up, we have a petition. We have a campaign against it. Our Ontario director, Jay Goldberg, a PhD, he's fighting it. Michael Geist, who's a professor, really smart guy, he's fighting it as well, and he's helping us. It is a threat, a massive threat to free expression and free speech in Canada. And I'm worried people don't realize what a threat it is. So what it is it's a proposed law that would put bureaucrats, the same ones at the CRTC who shut down Sun News Network, in charge of what is put online based on content. So when you go to Google search or YouTube or whatever your favorite thing is, they will decide then based on Canadian content where that ranking should be, meaning what you're going to see first, what's going to pop up or not. And if you combine that with the proposed law that they had last time, which was frequently called the Online Harms Bill, that's where bureaucrats are deciding what speech is harmful or not. That's a massive threat to your free expression. Now, to be clear, if you threaten to kill someone or commit sedition or treason or terrorism or all those other awful things, that's already in the criminal code, man. That's there already. If you want to have a conversation about adjusting that, fine. Take it up with the Department of Justice or the Justice Minister or the Attorney General. No. This is a heritage department thing. This is expression, culture, and power. It's controlling what you see and say online. And to review, we now have the government deciding who is a journalist. We have the government paying journalists that they choose to. And we have the government this close to deciding what you can see and say online. The implications for that, for conversations like this, or alternative media, or a grassroots organization like the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, are profoundly important, because it boils down to the simple question: how can you hold the powerful to account if you can't speak up.
That is the important piece in excuse me, this whole conversation. And that is why this would be a hill, a metaphorical hill to die on. Because if we are stripped of our ability to be seen in opposition, so let's say our show, just as an example, if we oppose even a conservative movement, it's a nonpartisan issue. If we cannot actively and publicly oppose, if we don't have that ability to speak against the authority can do whatever they want. If they decide that you shouldn't be allowed to drive more than 30 kilometers to work because of the environment, there's no opposition because you can't fucking talk about it. That is a huge problem. And that is why this has to be center to what we're talking about right now. I get chills even thinking about what would happen if we lose that ability.
I'll give you a quick example. Do we have another minute just for a quick example? Pretty please. I was on the Hill in the early 2000s. I was working on Parliament Hill when September 11th happened. And then I was on Parliament Hill when the invasion of Iraq happened. And as Reagan used to like to say, to my friends on the left, okay, do a thought process, do a thought experiment, okay? Think about the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. Think about all of the messages that you were getting on message boards. Think about the emails. Think about the alternative websites you might have been reading where people were organizing protests against the invasion of Iraq. Okay. I saw a lot of them. It was on a lot of typically left wing, but some, kind of more civil libertarian straight up websites. They were organizing the protests against the invasion of Iraq online. That is how the word of mouth spread. Okay. People were speaking up online. Okay. Then they had a massive protest in the dead of winter. I remember it was in January in Ottawa. It flooded the Hill. It was down, wrapped all the way around the American consulate, like signs, the whole bit. And a few days later, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien stood up in the House of Commons and said, no, we're not going to Iraq. What if all of those people who felt so strongly about that didn't know that the other one existed, weren't able to reach out and spread that information and share that information and have their voices heard online in order to organize such a peaceful demonstration and pushback? So that is what I would say to the folks who maybe are on the left wing of things thinking, oh, things are just fine. I'm fine with Justin Trudeau deciding what I can say and what I can see on the internet. What if he weren't in power? What would you do then? This is why freedom of expression is supposed to be fundamental. This is why. And this is why we have to fight.
This is why the organizations like the Canadian Taxpayers are so important. And frankly, this is something that I say at Take Back Alberta all the time. We say this on the podcast all the time, is it doesn't matter who wins elections if you're not willing to hold them accountable. I think that former Premier Jason Kenney really believed that he didn't have to hold people, or that no one would hold him accountable. And obviously that didn't work out so well for him. But it worked out really well for Doug Ford and other politicians, including Francois Legault. So in those maybe contexts, people didn't know that there were people that were upset and they couldn't organize themselves, and then the consequences are the consequences. So I think it's important that we don't just sit there and say, I'm blue team, I'm red team. It's government is bad team.
Yes.
That's absolutely that I want to be a part of.
Absolutely.
And I know that that's the part of that's the team you're on, Kris.
Yes.
I love that. So thank you so much for coming on our show. Unfortunately, Zach and I have to sign off here, but hopefully we'll have you on again, because we like to have great guests. And I think our listeners are going to love the wealth of knowledge that you have to provide. And 1 hour is just not enough to get all that.
That means a lot to me, and the invitation means a lot. And just very quickly, to folks who feel like they don't have power and agency, you do. Pick up the phone that member of parliament, write that email to your MLA, remind them that you're their boss. And if you don't get a response, tell them next time you're going to organize a group in your neighborhood and you're going to door knock against them in the next election, because you are the one in charge. Don't let government push you around.
Thank you very much, Kris. And thanks everyone for listening. One last little thing for those few of you who probably listened to the end of the episode. If you could review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any of the other ones, that's a huge help to us. We don't ask for any money to produce this, but we would love to get more reviews so we can keep going up in the algorithm.
Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's The CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.